sometimes we'd be shooting or producing something and we're like, is this it? Am I going to put this out in the name of the leader of one of the major political parties? This thing that I watched the edit for, or that like I was holding the camera for? There was some really, really surreal moments in politics where you're like, we're just sitting here in a room with the guy who just won the election. So like the day after he won, Trudeau comes by the Liberal Party offices to say, shake some hands, say thank you. And then we still had some videos to shoot that day, like our normal, like holiday greetings, that kind of thing. And we're in the room all together. And I remember our videographer looks at him and goes, so what do we call you now? Like at the time we had just called him Justin.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by TRUFAN. And before we get into today's conversation with Dave Summer, there's a couple things that we need to go over first. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to leave us a positive rating and review. Share this episode with a friend and subscribe to the show. But a brand new interviews every single Monday and a brand new takeaways episode is an audio exclusive where I sit down and break down the most recent podcast episode of the week every single Thursday. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited to present to you my conversation with Dave Summer. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. I am your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by TRUFAN. Today on the podcast, we are joined by Dave Summer. Dave is Instagram's public policy manager for politics, government, and elections. And prior to his time at Instagram, he was head of digital for Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And I'm very excited to have him here on the podcast today. Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Jacob. How are you? Thanks so much for having me. As I told you before, it has been a lifelong dream to be on someone's podcast, not necessarily have my own podcast. This is it. This is the dream come true today. So
I'm excited to hear that. I'm excited to have you here on the podcast. I mean, like, it was good because I was doing my prep work and I was like, you've never, as far as I could tell leading up to it, like when I was prepping, you hadn't done a podcast. So I'm stoked to have your first interview here on the show.
I have been studiously either, avoiding them or prevented from going on them due to job obligations. But I think, this is it. The stars have aligned. So that you're witnessing my dream come true in real time. It's happening right now.
This is great. And where I want to start today's podcast, on your first podcast, I want to go all the way back to the beginning. Were you born and raised, correct me if I'm wrong, Pierrefonds, Quebec?
In Pierrefonds, baby. So yeah, for those who don't know, that's in the suburbs of Montreal, in the area called the West Island, in the western suburbs. So yeah, born and raised there until I was about 17 years old.
Okay. And what did you want to be growing up? Because I'm assuming as a kid growing up in Pierrefonds, like you didn't want to be the Instagram's policy manager.
No, that sort of arose as a result of kind of like some interesting left and right turns in life. Growing up, I think the first thing I ever wanted to be was an architect. I didn't really know what that meant or what that entailed for a long time. But I wanted to be an architect. And then I kind of pivoted to wanting to be a screenwriter and then a speechwriter for a prime minister. So those were like the three things that I always sort of thought that I would be one day. And then I got really, really into radio and started sort of, moving myself in the direction towards it.
Interesting. I mean, I'm sure we'll probably talk more about screenwriting off air because that's something I'm getting super into right now. But I'm curious where the desire, the want to be a prime minister's speechwriter came from. Because that's very unique. Like there's no one I went to high school with that wanted that job.
Yeah, I was always like a smart ass debate club kid, in high school. And I don't really know where the evolution of it came from, but I always loved politics too, right? I was a political junkie and I loved writing. So I think, put the two together and that's where aspiration is coming from.
Okay. And so you ended up going to school, first year Carleton and then transferred to Concordia?
More or less. I went to Carleton for 2.5 years. And then I left to go do an internship for a whole semester in LA. And then when I came back from that, there was some job offers on the table in Montreal to sort of like work in broadcasting. One in radio at Chom FM in Montreal, classic rock station that's been around forever. And the other was at Musique Plus to be like a reporter / VJ. And I always love telling that story because my career at Musique Plus in Montreal lasted exactly 1 week. And I interviewed the band Less Than Jake, and they were like, thank you. Your French is not exactly where we need it to be at this time. And that was that. And I went through like a slew of like screening exams to get that job, like a music general knowledge quiz and interviews and all that stuff. And that was that. So all that said, I ended up at Concordia. I was quite happy to finish my journalism degree there. And I was, getting to do some fun stuff on the radio at Sean FM as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned that internship, and I don't want to gloss over that because that internship in LA was with The Tonight Show, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that was with The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. And I was very, very lucky to get that one. That arose because in third year journalism school at Carleton, you were asked to go get an internship, I guess, in the news business or in the broadcasting. At the time, I don't know what it was with me. I was feeling restless or who knows what. But at the time, I was like, let me try something different or maybe something a little more elaborate. I actually called The Late Show with David Letterman to see if they took interest. And I don't know if they did or didn't, but their receptionist was like a little bit curt with me or a little bit intimidating. And I was very intimidated. And I thought, oh, well, I preferred Letterman, but I was like, let's try Leno and see what they say. So I called them up and it worked out. I interviewed and I got it. And the weird thing is that semester ended up being the semester that David Letterman had his heart attack and his show was dark or using replacement host most of that time. So it's like a weird series of events. But anyway, I went out to Burbank for that whole semester, and that was a hell of a time. Like it was super interesting. To be fair, the interns, we didn't exactly get the most glamorous work. We were mailbag schleppers almost exclusively, like not even to the level of coffee schlepper. Like the paid production assistant staff was that, and at the time these internships were unpaid for a college credit only. And so we were just sorting mail all day. And of course, in the context of today, looking back on an unpaid internship like that, obviously I was very lucky to be able to do that. And, it just seems crazy now that you do that for 4 or 5 months.
Yeah. Fun fact actually about Letterman. So when he went dark, I had one of his guest hosts. I think it was from that period when he guest hosted Letterman. Tom Dreesen came on the podcast a couple months ago. It's just a fun little tidbit. But so was there any interaction with Leno at all? I think I saw an old photo of you and Leno. Was that just like he shows up one day to take a photo with the interns and then leaves, or like what was that?
Yeah, that was on my last day. That's on my Instagram profile forever. That was on my last day. You go up on stage with him and take a picture. Wearing a Sublime t-shirt. And there was I remember that photo because there was a lion behind us. They had some lion on from the circus or from a wildlife sanctuary, like this old, very docile lion. But I was sort of still kind of scared, like posing with Jay, like looking back over my shoulder. But he was, honestly, to answer your question, he was quite nice. You interacted with him a few times. He kind of stayed in his own world while he was doing the show. Like he had a sort of office that people called the bunker. It was like kind of like a self-contained apartment on the grounds. And then, when he'd come up to the office, he was very friendly. He'd do his little shtick with the interns that I sort of came to realize was his shtick with the interns. He'd be like, hey, how you doing? Hey, you sick of show business? No, you like it? Yeah. And then he'd walk out. And then, the one time I ever seriously interacted with him, we were alone in the kitchen, like in this kitchenette together. And he was like, so, what do you want to do? Do you want to do stand-up? Do you want to go in show business? I was like, well, I've thought about it. I would do stand-up. He's like, how old are you? And I said, I'm 19. And he goes, well, if you wanted to, you'd know by now. And then he walked out. And that was my interaction with Jay Leno. Nice guy, really nice guy.
And I think it was on your LinkedIn. It said job offer made at the conclusion of the internship. Was that for the Tonight Show, or is that when you got back to Montreal and you got a job offer when you got back?
Yeah. So that actually happened, a couple times. So at the end of my internship, they were like, do you want to just work here? And, I hadn't finished school. And so I said no. And it's funny because when I went back to work in Montreal and to work at Sean FM, the morning host there, Steve Anthony, was like, when I told him that story, he was so incredulous. He was like, why would you stay in school? Look at me. I host the morning show, on Montreal's sort of like renowned radio station. I didn't go to school. I didn't finish school. So, he sort of raked me over the coals for it. But at the time I thought it was kind of the right thing to do. So I went back and finished school. And then when I was done, a few years later, that option was still on the table to go back to the Tonight Show. But at the time, it just moving out to California for what was an almost unsustainably low salary was not really in the cards for me. And they said, most people who become production assistants here live with their family. The salary is quite low. And, at the time, I just thought it wasn't the right direction. Do I regret it now? Sometimes. But, I'm happy that I came home and finished school.
Okay, fair enough. And so when you were working at that radio station, was that the one was that 940 News Radio, or did that come after?
So that's a great question. So that job at Showm FM was just sort of like while I was in school. I would go out and do like wacky pranks on the radio, like wacky pranks into a microphone and try to like fool people. And I'd be like, hey, did you hear that they're changing the name of the Lazy Susan because Susan is offensive to people named Susan? And then, people would be like outraged on the street, like, oh, that's crazy. What is this world coming to, And then we put together like a little fun montage. But then when I graduated and became an actual journalist and who, was not allowed to do fake news, then I went to go work at a radio station called 940 News in Montreal, which is like an all news radio station. It's kind of like no longer with us, but there's similar formats in Ottawa and Toronto.
Again, a lot of this early stuff that I have is all courtesy of your LinkedIn account. So I got a lot of copy paste stuff. So you're doing multiple jobs. So you were writing, producing, and broadcasting, right? So you were on air doing everything.
Yeah, and you know what? That's the thing about that radio station. It was a small radio station. The ratings were very low. It's obviously defunct now. It didn't last very long. But what benefit or the advantage I got from there is that for a small place that was very short-staffed, I got to have a lot of responsibility. And I got to put my repetitions in over and over and over again, producing my own stories, writing my own stories, out there literally driving myself around in the company car that said 940 News on it, going to a story, writing, cutting it in the car, like on my little mini disc player, or getting back to the studio to cut it on our software. And then as I sort of spent more time there, I got to anchor a little bit. I got to line up shows, so it was a lot of fun. There was a lot of like opportunity to develop, some Swiss Army knife type skills when it came to broadcasting that sort of I would lean on forever to this day. Yeah.
This is probably a dumb question, so bear with me through this. What was the process for getting breaking news like back then in a pre-social media world?
That is a great question. Well, back then, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to think about like, how did we do things before social media, But back then there was a couple different ways, especially in local news. So like there was literally a pager that would sit on the assignment desk. And for example, if the cops, if there was a murder, a fire, anything like that, like our pager would go off. I guess you had to subscribe to the sort of cop service. And there was always police scanners. So if that was the kind of local newsroom you were in, where you just hear something popping on the police scanners. But of course, back then we had the news equivalent of social media, which was wire services. So you'd subscribe to Canadian Press or Associated Press, and then in our newsroom software, you just sort of like see the slugs come in, or like the story headlines come in all day long. Like this happened, that happened. And then, it was a little bit slower than Twitter, obviously, but it was still quite fast. And to this day, I remember the icon on that software was like a little house that was on fire, like a little flaming house to advise you that this was, in fact, breaking news. So that's how we got it in the old days, kids. Then we'd go over to this stone tablet and chisel in the news story. And then we'd somehow make copies of that and drop it off on your doorstep.
That's awesome. So I'm curious, obviously like with doing a lot of everything, how you mentioned with the smaller station, you're kind of getting a lot of experience, but you're doing a lot. What's the most stressful experience you ever had working in radio?
That's a great question. I would say, radio, all news radio is such a fast-paced, intense world that the whole job is sort of built on stress. So, you'd be in a situation where, you get to a house fire, the thing is still burning. Your editor is asking you, can you do a live hit, at 8:30 a.m. and then at 9 a.m. and you're still trying to get your bearings on the story. And honestly, that's kind of one of the ways in which the news business is losing its way a little bit, in that the sort of need for instantaneous filing, especially now where reporters have to also file to social media and to their traditional media, is crowding out just even basic news gathering. So, I got sent to some press conferences where, I'm embarrassed to admit I was asked to grab the press release when you get there and just file a hit right away on the radio by phone without getting to ask a question of the official who's giving that press. So that's the kind of stuff that would really stress me out far more than, a time crunch or, going to a really like tricky murder scene or fire or anything like that.
Okay. And then so you end up leaving radio after that and you go into TV, right?
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you were still reporting at that point. So you went from radio to TV. So was the dynamics different reporting on radio versus reporting in front of a camera?
Totally. And I was so nervous. I was very, very shaky in my first couple of years on camera because I was, I had a sort of self-conscious way about me on camera that I couldn't really practice my way out of instantly, like, but in general, the dynamics of putting together a TV story versus a radio story are somewhat the same. It's just, you're working and you're dependent on the teamwork you have with your camera operator who is there to save your bacon more than one time a day.
I'm curious if you think there's going to be less reporters today or like in the next generation that aren't as nervous going on camera. Because I feel like that's a very common thing to be nervous going on air. But when you think about Gen Z, they're used to being on camera since they were kids. So do you think that there's going to be they're going to be more used to that when they get into news roles kind of in the next couple of years?
That is a really, really great point. And I hope more of them are. And, you see young reporters on TV now. I don't necessarily know if it's a generational thing or a personality thing, a confidence thing, because you do see, still young reporters who go on TV and talk in that reporter voice, right? Which is, yes, maybe that's a measure of confidence or not, but, I still wish that a lot of reporters would just sort of speak in their normal voice. And you see a lot of young reporters now who are getting it and doing it, but others who aren't, and I just think confidence on camera, certainly I wish, I wish I had it back in the day when I first started. And when I see someone who is young and who has all that confidence, I'm like, good, they got it. It's great.
How can you, if you're not confident on camera, how can you develop that confidence? Is it just like you mentioned with radio, you got to put a lot of reps in? So it's just putting a lot of reps in?
Yeah, I wish I knew. Honestly, I wish I knew back then. The one secret that eventually allowed me to just sort of calm down a little bit on camera and just like keep it together and avoid like the nervous breathing was someone. There's actually two things. One was the anchor of the CTV Montreal News back then. His name was Bill Hoagland, and he took me aside after one like super nervous hit on my part, and he was like, "Hey," he literally said to me, "Hey, we wouldn't ask you to do this if we didn't think you could do it. So just do it." And like that really calmed me down and it was quite helpful. And then the second thing was just learning to look not at the camera but through the camera and talk to the camera like you were talking to your friend in a bar and just telling a story. And that sort of enabled me to forget about like cramming all the information that I have from my head into the microphone in record time and talking really fast and just talk as fast as I can so I don't screw it the hell up, but just in the end to just be more conversational and tell the story. And it took me a long time to sort of figure that out. And by the time I figured it out, I was off camera again. I was producing in my next job. So I was like, all right, well, that's for another time.
Yeah, your next couple jobs were producing, right?
Yeah. I ended up going to CTV Toronto. So I moved away from Montreal. I was, sort of contract work in Montreal, and I found this full-time job in Toronto at the same network. So I go to CTV Toronto, and I was doing some freelancing at the network, but my job was to produce the weekend show. And I did that for, I think, about a year and a half, and threw myself in on the air every once in a while. I tried to just stay just voiceover only, but I eventually, I don't know, I was producing the weekend show, and I remember I was starting to get disillusioned with it. And I was starting to get a little bit weirded out that as a reporter, I was reporting on what other people were living. And I remember it was Pride weekend in Toronto some year. I forget what it was. And I'm sitting there typing this headline to open the show, like, "A gorgeous day in Toronto and thousands come out for this parade on a beautiful sunny day." And I'm like literally in a windowless basement in Scarborough or a windowless, room in Scarborough. Just, man, this kind of sucks. And I started thinking like, okay, I love news. I've been a news junkie my whole life, but, I don't know if I'm the kind of person who has the temperament to be on the sideline for the rest of my career, and some people, they absolutely thrive on that, or they absolutely thrive on, being like the news hound who's out asking tough questions of people and all the rest. And like, I was just trying to figure out where my role was in news at the time when I was producing. And that would lead me to leave just sort of cold. I left CTV Toronto without really a backup plan. And then fate would intervene in that my father got very sick. So I went to go, be with him and take care of him for a few months. And when that was over, I needed some stability and some comfort and went back to news for a little while because I thought, all right, this is what I know and this is what I'm going to do.
How do you take that jump where you realize initially that news isn't what you want to do? You don't have a backup plan, but you leave anyways. Like, where does the confidence or the self-belief come from in that decision?
I don't know if there was a lot, Jacob. It was a strange decision on my part, and I got to be honest with you. Not to get too much into tragedy, but the day that my quitting became official, I just quit. I didn't have a plan, and I just quit. And my father, calls me to tell me, he's terminally ill, literally on the same day. So in a way, it was a small gift because it allowed me to go spend time with him. But at the same time, I was like, well, what am I going to do here? And I didn't really know, And at the time, I guess I wasn't really ready to leave because I ended up going back to CTV and then to other producing jobs afterwards.
Okay, yeah, because you ended up going to Sun after.
Oh yes, yeah. That was my last producing job. So I go back to CTV, and then I ended up working at CTV National for a bit, and same thing. This windowless room malaise took over me because the CTV National newsroom is crazily more dark than the local newsroom. Okay, in Toronto, and they had in fact upgraded the local newsroom to a place with windows. But National, no. It's just like what you see on TV with Lisa LaFlamme is what you get. That's the studio. I used to sit in the desk pod sort of right behind her where you can see on camera. And you sit there and it's dark. And I was, again, just like, this just doesn't feel right. Now, you might say, if that doesn't feel right, why in the hell would you go to Sun News Network? And that is a question I still sometimes ask myself. I was certainly not a partisan back then. I was certainly not a right-wing commentator or journalist. I was always pretty centrist, and certainly in my personal and professional life. And then this offer comes up, right? To go work there 9 to 5 and to produce a show 2 hours a day. And when I said, listen, I'm not like an opinion person, on either side, whatever, they were like, no, we're hiring straight news journalists. This is what we need. Just come over. Boy, did it take me about a day and a half to realize that was a bunch of bullshit. But, so I get to Sun News and I'm grateful for the opportunity, 9 to 5, windows, it was a good opportunity, but I didn't last very long. I lasted about 3 months before I realized I got to get out. Nothing is as it seems. And I desperately emailed my old bosses back at CTV News, and it was rightfully so crickets in response, right? Like they were pissed when I left and couldn't believe that I was going to Sun. And there were a lot of good people at Sun, don't get me wrong. There were a lot of good, hardworking journalists who just wanted to work, but the place was not a good station, it was not a good product. And that was that. It took me a while to get out of there, but eventually I figured out a sort of exit route.
Was part of the allure of Sun Network that it had just, because I did some Googling into it before, did it just launch shortly before you arrived, so you would be able to kind of influence a lot of the kind of the growth of that show and how it developed?
Well, it had launched about a year before, and that TV station had a couple of iterations, I think, before I got there. It was like a sort of fun lifestyle channel, and then it just sort of like morphed gradually into far right cable news. They used to call it Fox News North, and I got there, and this was at a time where they supposedly wanted to beef up the hard news section, but it just kind of never worked out. The audience obviously never grew, and I know there were a lot of issues with like the CRTC making the channel not mandatory for cable providers to carry, and a lot of what the network was relying on was that. But the bottom line is, it was not run like any news operation I never worked in my whole life. It was run like a political operation. It certainly was. And when that happens, when your goal is to sort of push a certain point of view, you end up losing on certain like basic production value, basic TV principles, basic eye-catching principles that are going to keep viewers engaged. You can't just have people rambling for 7 minutes about God knows what, 5 times a day. This doesn't work.
Before we get into the Liberal Party, I'm just curious what it was like working for Lisa LaFlamme. Like, when I think of CTV National News, that's the first person that comes to mind. Like, that's who I would have grown up watching on CTV National. Like, what was it like working for her?
Yeah, I got there right as Lloyd Robertson, her previous, her predecessor, was leaving after his long and distinguished career, and Lisa took over, and it was very well deserved. Everyone was like, well, Lisa is the obvious heir apparent, and so our paths didn't cross for too long. But she was great. Lisa's super professional. Very strict with words, if I could say, like a real wordsmith, sitting around that table, making sure every word, every comma is in the right place, going over her scripts. making sure it's exactly the way she wants, and then has to do it at 10 and at 11 and, tweak the show between the two shows if necessary or if news changes. So Lisa's such a great professional. It was really, really great to work with her, but, it didn't last very long before I was in the need to get out of that room, get out of that part.
Mm. And so how did the job with the Liberals come up? I know we talked yesterday, you mentioned how you noticed that they were kind of doing things ad hoc and they could really benefit from someone kind of coming in there and really doing it in-house. Like, was it you reaching out and being like, hey, I can help you with this? Or was there like a job posting? Like, how did that whole thing come together?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, so after my 3 months in Sun News, and I was like, I will literally apply anywhere, and I was. I was at a party where I ended up crossing paths with Katie Telford, who was his, I believe, Justin Trudeau's campaign manager back then, and has obviously been his chief of staff all this time. And Katie and I knew each other from way, way back in the day, from my first year of university. For both of our first year of university, we worked together as pages in the Canadian House of Commons. So, it's this program where eager young politics nerds can go work in the parliament, being messengers, that sort of thing, through the three buildings or several buildings of Parliament Hill. And it's a cool opportunity to learn about government. I love that year. That was the time of my life. And I had not seen Katie since then. And I see her at this party. And I believe Justin Trudeau might have been there as well. I don't remember meeting him that night. And I was like, hey, what are you up to? And she's like, oh, I work with Justin Trudeau. And then it was like this light went on in my head, like, oh, this could be interesting. Like it seems like he might win the leadership. Back then he was still, I don't want to say backbencher because he had huge name recognition, but back then he was still a Liberal MP. He was running for the leadership or about to. And then, from the time I saw Katie at that party to the time I was able to like secure a coffee with, someone who she had said, you should talk to this person, they're managing communications or whatever. It was a long, long, long process. And I got rejected the first time. So, I applied for, they were like, there's a communications job opening up. You should apply and interview. And I did. And in the end, they said, look, we need someone with a little bit more political experience because I had zero experience working with football. And, at that point, I'd been at Sun for, I think, a year. And I was like, okay, I can be patient because they had said, talk to us in the fall. There might be something opening up with things ramping up. And lo and behold, I thought they were just sort of being polite and telling me, thanks for coming out. So I called them back and I said, look, you're just being polite, let me know, and I'll drop this, but I really think I can be helpful. And they said, there's going to be stuff opening up at the Liberal Party offices in the fall, and come on back and try it out. So, I applied to that job and I got it. And I left Sun News about 2 years, almost to the day after I joined, and they were good-spirited about it, but they certainly teased me a lot for going from the conservative news station to the Liberal Party. And they put up these posters for my last 2 weeks on the job around my desk, like loose lips, sink ships, keep mum, she's not so dumb. All those like 1940s era propaganda posters, like, ha, 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 shut your mouth around Dave. It was all in good fun, I guess, but then I left and that was that.
Okay. And you mentioned yesterday too, we were on the phone, and also I found an old video of you speaking at an event or something like that. And you mentioned how
what video is that? God. Yeah.
I can't, it's like you in front of a whiteboard or something, and it's like super low lit.
I remember that.
But you were talking about how social wasn't even really a part of the job description when you started. You mentioned yesterday it was flyers. So what was So talk to me like the beginnings, like, did you know social was going to eventually become a part of it, or was it just like strictly kind of not?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're talking, this was in spring 2014 when I joined. So about a year and a half away from the election. And this was going to be a fixed election date. The previous Prime Minister Harper had put fixed election dates into place, which gave a little bit more certainty. And so I was hired, to sort of spiff up the external visual presentation of the party in any way that we can. And, it was one of those things where I get in the door and then we figure out what needed to be done. And at the time, Justin Trudeau's videos, he had a video operation, but it was run by guys who that wasn't their first job, who weren't necessarily, like that wasn't their main job at the party. They weren't necessarily in the communications department. It was a team of a few guys and a couple of women who were just sort of chipping in when they could to set up the video camera and shoot the box. And so when I came in, I was like, okay, I can learn from these guys how to operate this gear and how to work this lighting pretty basically because I've never been a cameraman. And then it sort of gradually took off on its own. I remember the first thing I ever did was run the prompter for Justin Trudeau for a few holiday greetings, like in the spring of 2014. I remember Nowruz, Persian New Year, and I think it was like Greek Independence Day celebrations in Montreal. And I just remember like, for those of you listening, my hands are shaking, and my hands are sweating and trying to like operate that prompter, and everyone just kind of laughing and Justin Trudeau just being, chill out, relax. It's okay, take a breath. So it's all right. He was fine. It was just like this iPad prompter rig. And so it started from there, and flyers and posters, right? Trying to work out how we could have more impact with our flyers and posters. And one of the first things we did was hire a proper graphic designer, and then a little while later, a proper videographer who could sort of take those things on. And so then we had a media operation going. And from there, we were able to turn our attention to the website and social media.
Okay. And so when you take that over, is it like the Liberal Party channels or both the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau's socials?
Basically, yeah. I mean, we were working on the party accounts and trying to figure out what worked, what didn't. Justin Trudeau's Instagram was still quite, casually being run back then. So it was a lot of things that needed to be, I guess, strategized for, if you can put it that way. You need to figure out, okay, how often are we posting? What are we doing? What's our goal here besides sort of like once a week posting? And what kind of story are we trying to tell? And figuring out also what worked for Justin Trudeau. Like, what is he comfortable with, in terms of like social media when it comes to what goes out with his name, what goes out with the party name, so on and so forth, and figuring out where the goalposts were for a long time.
And so how do you figure that out? Because the election's coming. So how does that factor into figuring all this out? Well, one, just trying to put the pieces together to have a strategy, but also knowing you're building towards an election that's going to start within the next year or so.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we had to sort of figure out, okay, what part of this social media is going to be like messaging on policy? What part of the social media is going to be, for example, criticizing the government because we were still in opposition? What was the tone we could take? And then at what point do we start rolling out like the quote unquote promises that were going to be part of our platform? And so, this is something that really started happening gradually over time, sort of discussing and figuring out, all right, this stuff is best handled on the Liberal Party. This stuff is best handled on the @JustinTrudeau accounts, and we go from there. And so as an election is coming, the social media is really just going to reflect the policy and the broader comm strategy or communication strategy for how to get that policy across. So I remember one of our first big promises, obviously, was what we called the Canada Child Benefit, which was an increase in, like, I guess, the baby bonus that we had in Canada. And at the time, what the promise was we're going to take all of the sort of like little tax credits, all of the or individual tax credits that were currently in place, bundle them into one and make it a little bit more generous. And I remember that was on May the 4th. So Justin Trudeau, famous Star Wars nerd, and the whole thing, we ended up putting out a bunch of comms that day that we made this announcement that was like kind of like Star Wars themed, May the 4th be with you kind of thing. Or like, if your family has 2 kids, Luke and Leia, you get this much money, this and that. That was like our early foray into trying to make policy relatable with mixed results. But I think we had some success that day. And we're like, hey, look, rule number 1 of political social media, like the stuff doesn't have to be super dry and boring all the time. And it can be fun without being irreverent or unserious.
And speaking of, like you said, rule number 1 of political social media, like at the time, so this was, you said spring 2014, you're kind of setting the precedent, right? Because there hadn't been, correct me if I'm wrong, but a ton of well done political social media to that point, right?
Well, I mean, there were a few accounts that were, I think, doing it really well. Like we borrowed and stole very liberally from the example that President Barack Obama set, obviously. But I think what ended up happening was we veered from it in that, Barack Obama had all this sort of groundbreaking stuff that he'd done. No president obviously had ever done that. That just showing him in a relatable way with either what we call influencers now, but like, stars of the internet, or here's Barack Obama casually in the cafeteria of the White House hanging out with people. Or, Barack Obama's social had these tentpole moments, right? Like, oh, did you see that thing Obama did on social? That's pretty cool. Whereas I think, what we tried to do differently was, instead of basing ourselves on major moments that will make people pay attention, we've got an opposition leader, we've got a government to dethrone in an election. I think we have to throw a lot of content at the problem. And so what we ended up doing was let's cover Justin Trudeau like a journalist covers a beat, right? And let's just be on him every day, reporting what he does and, posting pictures from what he does, stuff that, is ended up being pretty standard, I think, in political social media. And apologies if there were other politicians who were doing it, back then. But I thought, look, I don't see that in Canadian political social media right now. Why don't we just try that? And sort of, everyone was on board, and it ended up being a strategy that we pursued pretty much through the election.
Okay, and so you ended up being named creative director for the campaign, right? For the election campaign.
Yeah, and that was a lot of fun too. That there was a lot of cool stuff that we had to do on the campaign that I credit directly to Tom's leadership of the campaign and to the, we used to call him the leader, I guess, to Justin Trudeau himself, who was willing to try stuff, who was willing to show up and stand on the X, so to speak, and have a good time with the things we were trying to do, so long as we weren't making him appear to be unserious. So, for example, there was, he was a boxer that was well known, and he would do these boxing, training sessions. Sometimes there'd be a photo op, sometimes not. But before the first debate of the 2015 campaign, we went to go film. He did a boxing photo op, so we went to go shoot him, do that, and then we got to do this like little voiceover about how he wasn't the typical politician who was just going to jog for a photo op. He's going to box. Trying to convey the image that here's a new guy, a youthful guy who's not afraid to mix it up a little bit. And by the way, who actually boxes, as you know.
Okay. And I'm curious, did you know once the election was coming that you would eventually get the creative director? Like, was that a natural progression, or did that kind of come as a surprise?
No, I mean, I don't know if it was necessarily a surprise. I assumed that I would still have a say in how the social would get done. But, when an election comes around, it's a really, really good lesson in teamwork, because whereas before we were doing stuff with, 4 or 5 people on the digital team of the Liberal Party, all of a sudden you've got 20, right? Like the war room gets swollen with people, and it's a great thing. You just have to learn, like, okay, you are a cog in this particular machine, because we all have a collective goal to reach, which is getting the W on election day.
Okay. Is that overwhelming or a daunting task to face, to be the creative director for a national election?
No, because there were a lot of creative cooks in the pot. And I think that the senior folks who've been there much longer than me were able to take a lot off my plate. Of course, we had an ad agency, and that was doing a lot of that heavy lifting when it came to some of the TV ads you saw. But the other ones, I think you're right. Sometimes we'd be shooting, producing something, and we're like, is this it? Am I going to put this out in the name of the leader of one of the major political parties? This thing that, I watched the edit for, or that like I was holding the camera for, and that we edited on a plane on the way between Toronto and Ottawa. It was like there was some really, really surreal moments in politics where you're like, we're just sitting here in a room with the guy who just won the election. So like the day after he won, Trudeau comes by the Liberal Party offices to say, shake some hands, say thank you. And then we still had some videos to shoot that day, like our normal, holiday greetings, that kind of thing. And we're in the room all together. And I remember our videographer looks at him and goes, so what do we call you now? At the time we had just called him Justin. So it was like a weird adjustment that was us, just like with a Sony, camcorder. I mean, good Canon camcorder, but that was just us doing the stuff. And then of course the social media revolution meant the tremendous democratization of media. Like you say, everyone in their phone is now on camera shooting, editing, cutting.
And talk to me about that. I did, again, my knowledge of this election came from Wikipedia. So if any of it's wrong, please let me know. This is the first election I voted in, which is another fun fact.
Oh, nice.
But it was an 11-week election, right?
Yeah.
11 week was the road to the election. Talk to me about the grind of that, because I'm assuming you're traveling to all the different rallies and things like that. And the closest thing that I can kind of relate to that is when I did 67's playoffs. It wasn't quite that long, but I was like on the bus driving to random small towns all over Ontario for like a 2-month period with not much rest. So I'm curious what that was like for you during the election.
Yeah. So I was actually based in the war room. So I only traveled once or twice for election related things, if I'm not mistaken. One of them though, I had this giant green screen tarp. And I remember I had to walk through Toronto dripping sweat. But most of the time I was in the war room. But that said, in a previous job, at CTV when I was producing, I got to be the sort of like house producer on the Progressive Conservative bus in the 2007 Ontario election campaign. So all the news organizations pool their money, and like I got to sit there as the producer on this bus, and that was 30 days from one town to another town in Ontario nonstop. And that was honestly, as tiring as it may have been, it was like the thrill of a lifetime. I love that stuff. It was fun to like be on tour, you know. So all that said, I didn't really budge much during the campaign, but after we won, and after sort of we fell into a rhythm and I started working in the Prime Minister's office, then yeah, I got to go on more trips and got to sort of be alongside as we traveled through Canada and got to go on some cool international trips where, you know, that grind is intense, but obviously super thrilling and super fun. And, you know, it was just like, there's nothing like it.
But bring me into that war room then during kind of, if you're back in Ottawa, what's the process like when you have a team capturing content at different rallies? Is it coming back to you? Are they posting live from the event? Like, what does that look like? What's the review process like too? Because you mentioned how like you'll be sitting there and you're like, am I about to make a post for like a national political party? Is there like different layers of people it has to go through? And like, how does that impact trying to do coverage live? Like, what does that whole thing look like?
Yeah, I mean that was the crux of I think why we were able to have a little bit of success in the campaign on social, because we worked out our approval processes beforehand and we made them as streamlined as possible. And I think, you know, what we were driven by, there was a news story, if you look it up, about like Mitt Romney's 2012 election campaign that was haunting all of us, because there was some article that came out that was like, Mitt Romney's tweets or Mitt Romney's Facebook posts need to go through like 9 layers of approval, right? And we were all like, to hell with that. We are gonna get this as streamlined as possible right away. You know, so is it a video script, and how quickly can you get it to Justin Trudeau to like look at it, approve it, move on, and so forth? If it's a tweet, a Facebook post, what are we doing to make sure that as many eyes as possible get on that, but in a way that, you know, there's one set of eyes that says yes, no, and if anyone has a problem with it, speak now or forever hold your peace. So we were able to sort of have this system whereby, yeah, like footage would come in from the road or photos would get in from the road. Then everybody knew exactly what was expected of them when it came time to like getting the content out the door and getting it approved quickly. And so like I think that was, when you talk about the team effort on social media, hugely important. And when I talk to political social media managers to this day, you know, that is always something that still takes a tremendous amount of foresight and thought for everyone, which is like, how can we get these approvals scaled down and streamlined so that they're not clogging up the whole works?
And so like, what is, obviously it's going to be case by case, but like, what is the ideal scenario for that today? Like, is it similar to what you guys did back then? Like, what does that process for review look like? Like, how do you streamline it for today?
And I think the first thing you do is make sure that you got buy-in from all the higher ups, right? Like, so we're managing upwards, as a term that was taught to me when I got to the Liberal Party. So, you know, you want to manage upwards, make sure that all the higher ups know what you're asking of them, how quickly you want to turn around. And that at the same time, if they give you feedback, you know, ideally it'd be specific and actionable. And if they do that, then it's not up to me to like gum up the works and be like, no, can we really do this? You know, like I'm asking them for a quick response quickly and a million things they got to do during the day. So let's just get on the same page quickly and go. And so, you know, I think that the idea that it's insurmountable is maybe a little bit overwrought. Like it's always easy to get a quick approval process in place. But I think a lot of the challenges are in politics when you've got social media is, first of all, making sure your principles. So your member of parliament, your congressman, your senator, your prime minister, whatever, making sure you understand the boundaries that they want in the posts. How much, you know, how many eyeballs do they want on the post or not? What do they trust you to post without them? And then what is the approval process within the office? Does the chief of staff have to weigh in? Does the director of communications always have to weigh in? Instagram stories was a big one, right? So on Instagram stories, we're like, look, if we've got to get approvals for stories, it doesn't work, right? Like this is a more spontaneous kind of way of communication when they first came out. When Snapchat first came out, we were like, look, we need to streamline this a lot. And to be honest, there was a lot of buy-in from leadership on that kind of stuff. And I always push people now, if they're having trouble getting buy-in from their DComs and from their chiefs, to, you know, just like PowerPoint your way out of the problem, which is make a PowerPoint that shows fun, spontaneous content. It goes up and does really, really well. And the more we add different layers of constipation to this post, it's going to be absolute trash and no thing.
So I know it's been a few years, but if you could ballpark, like what was if you could estimate the total time from someone records that content to posting it, and then what kind of the total output for like a rally would be. I'm just curious from that perspective, because like working in sports, like the rally is the equivalent to the game day. So it's just like, what does that output look like?
That is a great question. So, rallies, we ended up falling into a pretty cool rhythm in that, we kind of knew what we would get out of each rally. And by the way, rally footage, when you put it up on political social media, isn't necessarily going to get a lot of, clicks or likes because it's expected. A beautifully done montage of the prime minister or the prime minister to be speaking at a rally is always great. But, I always say like, you can really kill yourself doing a beautiful 2 minute, piece and montage, but it won't necessarily do as well as a picture of like a politician and their dog just chilling at home. Like that is the reality of the social media world we live in. People want to see a little bit more authentic moments. I'm dancing around your question. To come back to your question, it could be as fast as a couple of hours. There'd be those moments of zen where you'd be like, okay, we have our videographer at the rally. He's shot it beautifully. He's cut it beautifully, like in the van, and Matt Snowy was our first videographer. Daryl Dean was our first graphic designer. And sometimes Daryl would put like beautiful titles on the thing. And, we'd have it and we'd be ready for approval. And everyone would be sort of alert and waiting because we wanted this footage out. And it could go up anywhere between 2-3 hours to you're waiting. Not necessarily for any other reason than just this is a political operation and people are busy and it takes a while to get approval sometimes. So you could be waiting who knows how, right? But like, I think everyone past a certain point understood, look, these are important things that we want to communicate to folks, and we got to get it out. We got to get it out the door.
And so you mentioned earlier the day after the election. Bring me back to the day of the election. Wake up from when you go to bed. What is that day like?
Well, I'll tell you about the night we won. I remember we won, and I was in the war room, and the war room had emptied out for election night. People had gone to various different sort of polling locations across the country, or they were traveling with the PM at headquarters in Montreal. And so I was just sitting there, and the news came over first that we won. And it was just dead silence. And then, was it a half an hour later, who knows, the idea that we had won a majority, then it was just, like it really sunk. You know what I mean? And then we went to a party and we had a nice party, and I remember hunched over my laptop tweeting from the party, thinking, okay, this is my life for the next little while. But the next day, it was a lot of business as usual. And, PM, I think, went out to go do a photo op thanking people in the subway in his home riding. And then there was like an eerie transition period where, folks went into the prime minister's office, went into the transition office, and just sort of were doing business. And there was nothing much happening. So I remember that time being a struggle sometimes to find transition content that was going to be interesting or sexy, as opposed to just like the PM sitting at a desk in like an empty room somewhere. And then eventually from the little party offices, you started to see like a bit of an exodus because people were getting hired to go work in the government. And then the time came for inauguration, and you may remember or may not remember the prime minister sort of like famous, because it's 2015 clip, that went very, very viral. And then from there, it was an absolute whirlwind. First couple of years, whirlwind, just nuts. The attention on him at that time was unbelievable.
And so, I mean, back to your point too, of when just going through the night when you realized you won and had a majority, I wrote the numbers down here again, courtesy of Wikipedia. So feel free to correct these if they're wrong.
I don't know these off by heart. Come on now.
Fair enough. But so it was because going into the Trudeau had 30, or the Liberal Party had 36 seats going into the election. So to go from that to a majority was just,
it was bananas.
Yeah. I can only imagine how crazy that was. And just, I know the grind of tweeting from parties. Like I've been there, so I understand. Obviously not, I've never tweeted from winning an election party, but tweeted at many, many parties in my life.
What's the worst place or like the grungiest or most unexpected place you've ever tweeted for work from?
I'm trying to think because like I lived work for so long. Like I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't like, I just think like when people ask me if like, I don't think of random places. I just think of working at an arena in Sudbury that has like the world's spottiest Wi-Fi, and I'm like in a tunnel under concrete trying to get like, we just won in triple overtime. It's midnight. This game was supposed to end 3 hours ago, and I'm trying to get like graphics and stuff posted of like that we just swept the second round of the playoffs, and it was just like craziness. The players are celebrating, so I'm trying to grab like, and I was pretty much the only social person on the road. So it's like trying to record content, we'll upload content, we'll make graphics, and like, it was insanity. So that's probably like not necessarily, I mean, the Sudbury is a little bit grungy, but not like anywhere. It's like an expected place because I worked in sports hockey prior to football. And so that was probably the most challenging place I've ever tweeted from.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense. And in politics, that's, when you're on the road, when you're traveling, that's kind of just the way that it is. You are expected to sit down on the floor of an airport. Or in my case, I would answer my question by saying in the floor of the security shack at I think it was a Toyota plant in Cambridge, Ontario, if I'm not wrong. And we had a video, and we didn't have a videographer who could make it out to that event. So I just like literally shot it on my phone, and I'm sitting there editing it on the floor of the security shack on iMovie. And I'm like, look, I loved it. What am I going to say? I didn't love it. I loved it. It was fun. I felt like I was, doing something really, really adventurous. No matter how crappy sometimes the physical accommodations of working in politics can be.
How often did you find yourself in the background of someone else's content while you were trying to capture your own content?
All the freaking time. And let me tell you, my friends and my ex-colleagues at CTV News would send me screenshots of just the feed of me just sitting there like like dopily walking around in the background or checking the mic before the event because their camera feeds would be on for a while. And, you try to be not in the shot. Staffers should not be in the shot. It's, one of the cardinal rules of political comms. But it happens, and I'd always hear from it from my colleagues at CTV. Funny you should bring that up.
Yeah, no, I relate to that. I always think back, it was the first 67s draft that the new GM and assistant GM are working at. And there's a photo of them calling in the first draft pick. And there I am behind them with like my phone standing over top of the photo, like taken. So I saw a photo of you somewhere where you were in the background. So I was curious if that was a struggle you had to go through.
That was with the Irish Prime Minister. That was, I think if that's the one you're talking about, there's... So the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, is welcoming us in Dublin, and Prime Minister Trudeau'S there, and they're sitting, face to face in the chairs. And it's like the photo op for the first 5 minutes of the meeting where they bring the media in, everyone's clickety, and then they kick everybody out. And there's just, I don't know why, you could see my head just sort of like right behind them, and I'm just there with my little camera phone taking a little picture for the socials. And that was probably one of the more notorious ones. I have them saved in a folder somewhere, like times where you just see like my big old head in the background behind the Prime Minister, usually squinting at my phone. Yeah, that's sometimes you're just working and you don't notice, and the journalist will holler at you to get the hell out of the shot, and you're like, oh, sorry, and you're just in the background.
Yeah. And so when did you learn that you were going to be moving into the Prime Minister's job? Like, when did you learn that you were going to do that job?
Yeah, a few months after the election, and let me tell you, that was a rough few months for my peace of mind because I have to complete this job. And so we win, and working at the party was great, but I was like, look, we won. I would love to work at the Prime Minister's office. It would be super cool. And so the call came, and it worked out. And so I got there, I think, in February of 2016. And then we hit the ground running, and it was just so much to do, and we were still staffing up. Like, I think there were a lot of articles written at the time about how Liberals their PMO was taking it slow to staff up. And I got there a few months later, and the office was still somewhat empty, although we started filling out the slots. But it was, it was a while before we had a few more hands on social media. So it was pretty crazy.
And so does that mean your office was out of the Parliament buildings? Yeah.
So the Prime Minister's office, the actual building called the Prime Minister's office, is right across the street from Parliament. It's part of the House of Commons. At the time, it was called the Langevin Building. The name was changed because Hector Louis Langevin was one of the architects of the Indian residential school system. And a few years ago, the Prime Minister was like, we are changing the name of this building. Obviously, super glad that happened. And so now it's just known as the Prime Minister's office or PPO. So he also has an office inside the House of Commons itself, which is often where we go to meet with him or to do video shoots when it came to official messages.
Okay. And once he became prime minister, were you more running kind of both accounts still like because now you're not running the Liberal account, you're running the prime minister of the PM Canada, and were you still running the Justin Trudeau account?
Yeah, so the Justin Trudeau accounts were the ones that we were running. The Liberal Party, obviously, we couldn't touch that anymore, like in government. So you're not using a government resource to do anything to do with the Liberal Party accounts. And then the account that a lot of people also know on Twitter, at Canadian PM, that's run by the bureaucracy. So same thing, we don't touch that account. So we're really focused, on managing those personal accounts. And at the time, his Instagram account, like I said, was kind of an occasional thing. And so, we took that on as well with everyone's blessing and huge collaboration of obviously the Prime Minister's photographer, who's so well known and renowned, Adam Scotty, who, just like such a dream to work with when it comes to all that stuff as well. And, the Prime Minister was on board, same thing. And we're like, boss, all right, there's this thing called Snapchat. He's like, yeah, I know. Like, what do you want to do? And he's into it. But he was always very candid about the fact, he's like, look, Canadians don't expect me to be on social media all day. They know I'm not. I'm not trying to pretend I am, right? Like, he's got this communication staff that he works with. And that's pretty standard in political social media right now. Although you do have, of course, the odd unicorn who does it exclusively themselves. And do I think that's a much more effective way of running social media? The answer is hard depends there, because it depends what kind of goals you're trying to achieve as a politician.
And so how big did the social and content team or the digital team end up getting during your time there?
Not very big, my dude, because as any political social media office will tell you, there's just very short staff, right? Like, so it's a department that never has as many bodies as you might expect for the amount of content that's being churned out, and that's just popular. Of course, political offices are always kind of understaffed, especially at the member of parliament level, where is it one person who is the spokesperson, communications person, special assistant, and when they have a minute, the social media. Right? Like, that's too often that's the case, and I understand that. Obviously, I do find that sometimes social goes to the bottom of the sort of hierarchy of needs in a politician's office just because of the insane.
And how many, like you mentioned Snapchat, like how many platforms were you posting on at a given time?
Yeah, I mean, it all depended, right? And at the time, because we were somewhat short-staffed, it was hard to sort of customize things for each platform. I used to say, like, we only got two hands, right? So if you're at the thing and you're trying to shoot for Snap or Instagram stories, plus do a live. At the time, live was just starting. Instagram Live. The first Instagram Live we ever did was during the PM's term. I think Malala had come to the House of Commons, so they had a meet and greet, and that was the first time we went live on IG. It was a lot, so we couldn't always post everything to every platform, and I had this really, really intense fear of failure in terms of like the platforms becoming ghost towns. Oh, here's his IG that you never post to. How come you never post to? So I tried as much as we could to get a churn going as much as you can on the different platforms, but that was ad hoc. Like, really now to be successful, I think the most successful people have strategies for what platform you're going to feed and water when with what kind of content. For example, at the time we started the Prime Minister's LinkedIn, and he was into that, but we don't post every single time day to day on LinkedIn. The PM personally loved Quora, the question and answer website. Okay, so he's like, can we do a Quora Q&A? Absolutely, boss, let's do it. I'm into it. Yeah, but how often are you going to do one of those? So finding that strategy of like which platforms you go to when was something that it took us a while, I think, to find our rhythm. And now would I still do things the same way? I don't know, right? Because do people want to read 1,000 tweets a day from a politician? I don't know. I really don't know. It's something that I think about all the time.
On LinkedIn, did you ever like accidentally click on someone's profile when you're managing the PM's account, and then now that person's going to get a notification that Justin Trudeau just viewed your profile?
Short answer: oh yes, that happened every once in a while. I mean, there was that. There was, I think, one time, I think towards the end of my time there, I was doing some research on something, and I accidentally tweeted from the Prime Minister's account like the name of the thing that I was looking for. Like, you get that sometimes. Yeah, there were a couple moments where I'm like, shit, I just liked that thing. Like, was I me? Was I the PM? Was I something? Was I the test account? But in general, we tended to avoid disasters like that.
No, I ask because I'm like 90% sure that Swish Goswami, who's TRUFAN CEO, which sponsors this podcast. I also work with them on some stuff. I'm pretty sure Trudeau looked at his profile one time and he was like,
It is highly
watch.
possible. It is highly possible. You never know, right?
Yeah. And he's highly like, he's got 140K or something like that on LinkedIn. So like he would have been probably prominent on LinkedIn at the time. But that's why I asked that question, because I think that happened to him. And to your point too, of like, of tweeting accidentally from the wrong account. Like I can remember one of my coworkers at the Red Blacks going to the cottage and posting on their Snapchat story, like their personal story about their trip to the cottage
Yeah.
without realizing they're on the Red Blacks account. And like that stuff definitely happens all the time. And so, and also this is actually something I saw in a photo. Were you still using a BlackBerry in 2017?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, look, I will say this. There was a significant amount of my personal data plan sacrificed for the country. Okay. And all of us did. Because at the time, we still had Blackberries, which like literally didn't run the social media apps. Or if it did, it would run them at a snail's pace. So that's life, right? Like sometimes we had to run these apps from our personal phones, stream press conferences from our personal phones, just brutal. But eventually we got government iPhones, which was great. And full credit to our government IT team. They like gave us these really, really sleek devices that were quite secure. I say secure, PM, knock wood, his socials have never been hacked, which is great. Like we would literally, put it this way, we would take extraordinarily analog steps for password security, which was always sort of like our fail-safe.
And so I'm curious, like you mentioned, alluded to it a little bit earlier, but what kind of content works best for the prime minister, and how do you balance? Because you said it's kind of the personal content, him chilling at home with his dog. How do you balance wanting to optimize content for social, but also knowing that this is a globe, like a country's leader? So there's obviously stuff that you're going to have to post that might not necessarily perform well. Like, how do you balance those things, and what does work best?
Yeah, that's obviously in my job now, which I know we're going to talk about. A lot of what I talk about to audiences, almost on a weekly basis, which is how can a politician be effective while also, talking about their personal life in a relatable way on social media, and that it's not always possible. But what I said about the dog reminds me, not a lot of people know the prime minister has a dog, and the dog doesn't end up on social media a lot, which is like a weird side thought I'm having right now. But nice dog. But I think the key is to think of it this way, right? When you are managing social media for a politician, when you are a politician on social media, it's, I think, super important. The ones who have the most success are the ones who try to come across as much as they can as a regular person who has a job in politics, as opposed to a politician who is like using their social media as an announcement machine purely for work only. We try to say, think about using social media like you like to see your friends' social media. Think about, what is relatable to you when you look at posts you like, meme accounts you like, brand accounts you like. And trust me, there's nothing cringier than those freaking brands that try to act human, on Twitter and various social media platforms. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be like brand X, telling you that their brand of coffee is Bay or whatever the hell, they're trying to do. But you know what I mean? Like I'm looking at a guitar pick right now. So I'm like, guitar picks are Bay, like nobody cares about that stuff, right? Like what's important is that you show that you're a human being, warts and all, as much as you can, without being, like I said, like irreverent or unserious in the work that you're trying to do. So when that comes to the prime minister, people were very curious about his family those first couple of years. People were very curious about his personal life, his hobbies, his jogging. There was a picture of him just like in a t-shirt from a brewery in Thunder Bay, and that caused a sensation because he was just like a regular guy on a hike with his family. And as the years go by and the pressures of office take over, it tightens up a little bit, necessarily so. But as much as, and I think they do a good job now, people who are in that office, obviously, I'm biased. Those are my colleagues. I think for all of the years that have gone by and for all of the crap that you go through in a life in politics, and another election has come and gone, they're still able to portray the prime minister as a guy who's just like his own guy with his own opinions, with his own life, who likes to weigh in on social and pull back the curtain when he can, as much as he can.
Were you, I'm pretty sure when Obama came to Ottawa, were you there for that?
I was there. That was great. Memorable.
What was that? What was that like?
It was hectic and crazy. I think you're talking about the Three Amigos Summit.
Yes.
when the president of Mexico came as well. Yeah, that was super fun. It was a crazy busy day. It was like a whirlwind. I don't even think Obama slept here or here being slept in Ottawa, but it was a lot of fun because you got to think that you were like witnessing this cool moment, this like unique moment as much as possible. Like Obama, you know, in Canada doing the thing that Canadians expect, an American president coming to Canada and showing respect and praising the nature of our special relationship, which Canadians, love and appreciate. It was something I'd never forget. And then, of course, getting to visit Obama at the White House, our first go around down there was also like just the craziest day. So much fun.
I still remember, to your point about how you guys were looking to make Justin just look kind of like a regular guy that has this job. I remember that trip that when Obama came, I saw a tweet. I think it went viral within Ottawa at least. And it was like Obama took like an 18-car motorcade to get to Parliament. And I'm like 99% sure Justin Trudeau took an Uber. Like just to him, like being a regular person. Like I just remember that tweet sticking out because that's just the perception between the two guys is like, Justin Trudeau's just doing the very normal person thing to get to this global summit, for lack of better. You know what I mean? Like it was just his perception.
Now he doesn't take Ubers, obviously, but like he would walk to the office every once in a while. I don't know if he still does, but he'd walk from his place to Parliament, just like because he does, or at least in my day anyway. He does make these efforts, like as much as he can, to just try to do a normal thing. Like he really understands that you have to do those things in order to sort of like be a little bit grounded as much as even if you're in the bubble of being prime minister. I remember, to that end, people would often insult Justin Trudeau and say, "Oh, he's selfie boy, Mr. Selfie, selfie this, selfie that." But really, he would not post a lot of selfies. It's not like he would send us selfies to post on social media. But that day with Barack Obama, they took one in the office together, and we posted. Of course, it went like mega, whatever. But when people insult him as selfie boy, I'd always be like, "What?" First of all, he goes to events and people want to take pictures with him, so he sits there and he's very happy to do it. He would always say he would get energized from those kinds of interactions, whereas his father, as prime minister, was a little bit more private. But at the same time, look what you see now. Every single politician, right, left, center, taking selfies all the time, posting selfies all the time, right? Like this idea that he was sort of criticized for that never sat right with him.
Obviously, like with that Obama selfie, like you post that, this is going to go nuts on social. It's going to perform well. What is some content that you thought was going to do really well that didn't? Because I found working in social, it's always like the content piece you spend 12 hours working on that will get nothing. And then you'll take like some half blurry selfie and post it that does like the best post you made the last 3 months.
Totally. Could not have said it better myself. That's exactly the experience we had over and over and over again. And I think you know the reason why, right? Spontaneity, showing something a little bit unexpected. If it's unexpected and interesting, doesn't matter how freaking blurry the photo is, people will love it, right? Because it's relatable to the way people take pictures on their own. And so from a like personal life side, of course, a picture of JT and his kids and his family in the basement, painting the walls is gonna be a huge success. And a more produced piece or infographic that we spent forever on trying to pitch Canadians on some policy that's like medicine they have to take down is never going to do well, even though it's really important. And the sort of corollary to that is when it comes to talking about policy, not just personal, right? Like the majority of the posts are about the business of being prime minister, the business of being in government. And so we'd always struggle with, man, we worked our ass off on this thing and it didn't do that well. And so, especially when it came to infographics, we learned the hard way after a lot of practice that people don't want to click on elaborate infographics on social media. They just don't. And so one day we had a really, really positive jobs report when we'd been in office for a while. And it was like the lowest unemployment in Canada in 40 years. And so I was like, like walking through the desert, starving for some engagement. And finally we had this amazing piece of good news for the country. And I was like, all right, one more try, and we just put, I think it was like white words on a red background or red words on a white background. Lowest unemployment in 40 years, and that ended up being one of the most engaged with pieces of policy content we've done in his time in office, right? Like keeping it super simple, direct to the point. And by then, there were plenty of accounts that had caught on. And I obviously have to give credit to conservative leaning accounts who are really, really good, right? Like just conveying a simple, effective message, one or two lines on a background, just get people's attention. Obviously, we're not going to talk about whether or not I agree with the value of that from an ideological perspective, but at a certain point, you have to understand that people only have one click to give, and they've only got a few seconds with their eyeballs to.
And then talk to me about growing the account, because when he became prime minister, he had around 2 million. Today he's at 5.6, was probably a little bit lower than that when you left. But what does growing his accounts look like? Like, is that an active part of the strategy, or is that just kind of something that happens organically through those tempo moments? Like when he's taking a selfie with Obama, like naturally it's going to grow. Like, what does growing his account look like for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you this. There was never really, we never really made attempts to growth hack or do any of the tactics, first of all, that Facebook would end up cracking down on while I was still at PMO, or to try to sort of trickily get people to like or follow, that kind of thing. I think when it comes to organic content, what you're trying to do is just put out stuff that, I guess I would phrase it as you're trying to balance the ice cream with the broccoli, right? So you have to give people the broccoli on social media because you're a politician and you're trying to show that you're doing that hard work and flexing those muscles. And if people will agree with you, great. And if they'll click like, great. And you've got a small segment of the audience that loves you and a small segment of the audience that's just going to troll the living hell out of you and tell you you're a communist who's ruining Canada. And then you got the middle who may or may not click, right? But at the same time, you kind of also know after a certain point that this picture will do well, or this holiday greeting will do well in this community. So that the account will grow sort of according to a predicted rhythm with spikes when there is something interesting happens, when there is a major national crisis. And so what I've noticed in the past year on Instagram, talking to politicians and their teams, is that the pandemic has affected the reach of so many politicians and government accounts around the world so immensely, and has really brought eyeballs to those accounts, because in times of crisis, people will look to the government for instruction, for reassurance, for literally just official news about lockdowns and all the rest. And there's follower spikes everywhere, all around the government, all around the world. It's pretty intense to see what had happened.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And when did you ultimately make the decision to leave the prime minister's office? Like, when did you, for the job in Instagram, like when did that become a reality?
It's funny because I feel like we didn't actually talk about why I decided to get into politics. I had met Katie Telford at a party and thought, oh, this is an interesting idea. I got into politics. I think the driving force was this idea that, previous liberal leaders had really been the victim of a lot of attack ads from previous conservative leaders, not to get partisan at all. But I thought, look, if I could go help out in comms and help the next liberal leader sort of defend themselves against the onslaught that people knew was going to come, right? Like the negative ads and the attack ads and all that. If we could come back with a little bit more of a spirited defense, if we could throw an uppercut here and there, maybe that would be helpful. And I genuinely thought that in 2019, I would stick around and do the same thing. And hopefully, we'd have a little bit of success as well. But I definitely, by the early 2019 time, I definitely thought this is going to be it, right? Like election 2019, win or lose, I'm out. And it's been great because politics is a lot of things, but obviously it's a huge grind. And I thought, okay, I had done sort of my share there, and it was time to move on. That said, Instagram had this opportunity that opened up, and I was like, look, win or lose, this is the kind of thing that I would want to do anyway. And my health was not great at that time. There was a lot of stress related stuff, and everyone in politics goes through this kind of thing. A lot of people have written about the stress of working in politics, and I am not at all trying to say that sitting at a desk tweeting is physically taxing in any way. Just after a certain point, being on call 24/7 is that's a lot, and I could make it last at the end of 2019, or this amazing opportunity has come up, so I'm going to go. And it was kind of right along the lines of what I wanted to do, so it's time to go.
Despite it being along the lines of what you wanted to do, and you were going through burnout, you were experiencing, you're going to get to that stage, was it still a difficult decision for you to make?
Hugely so. I literally, I wondered to my prospective boss, look, can I come after the election? And he was like, no, hell no. We have an opportunity. We need someone now to sit in the office and do the things. So I certainly was torn. I loved politics, but in the end, it was like, and I still love it for sure. In the end, it was like, look, I'm burning out, like you said, a bit at the end of my rope, and there's also this cool thing happening. So let's just jump in and do it, and whatever happens, happens.
Did you tell Justin yourself when you were leaving? Like, what was that conversation like?
Oh man, let me tell you that memory is burned in me because to get time on the prime minister's calendar as a staffer for a project that you're working on is a process. You need to go through the scheduler, get approval from your boss, like make sure everything's legit, brief the PM, the whole thing, and then you've got your 10 minutes to shoot your video, and the PM arrives in the room, and you do your thing. And he was always very flexible, but like the rule of thumb is like never waste the prime minister's time. He's coming in the room, it's because he's ready, he's briefed, we brief him quickly, good to go. Like, if you're unready, that's like, it's kind of like a bit of not a bit of a faux pas. Don't do that to a politician. But for whatever the hell reason, I don't know what got into me. I just like walked towards his office. And I remember Adam Scotty, the photographer, was outside. And I guess he must have seen the look on my face. He's like, dude, are you okay? And I was like, I'm talking to the boss for a minute. And he's like, yeah, go ahead. I like never in a million years would I have done that before or after. I guess, I don't know what possessed me to do that. But I walked in and same thing. The prime minister was like, are you all right, dude? And I was like, yeah, I don't think he told me to, but she's like, are you all right? And I was like, yeah, well, listen, boss, I gotta tell you, I think it's time for me to go. I'm gonna go to Instagram. I've got this opportunity. And then he was like, oh, what? Like, relax, it's fine. Don't worry about it. He gave me a hug, and that was that. And then, it was such a huge weight off my shoulders. But I mean, he's the prime minister of the country. What does he care about me leaving with my big news? It's politics. People come and go all the time. So he was super cool about it. And then, made a tradition in the office. Everyone who leaves then eventually gets to have like a sit down and debrief with them. And that was nice. And, it was nice to just say like a real goodbye after that. And that was that.
Did you make sure on your last day your outfit was slim fitting as per requested?
No, so Scott, trust me, the politics 15 is very real. It was more like a politics 15 or 30, pounds that I put on, late nights, junk food, and all the rest. And Adam Scott, a photographer, like joked around like, hey, for your goodbye photo, wear something a little bit slim. But screw it, whatever I've got on. So that's that.
And then so now talk to me about Instagram. Talk to me about day one. What's it like? You get to DC, go to the office for the first time. Like, what is that like?
Well, day one was at headquarters in Menlo Park, California, like near Palo Alto, because that is where headquarters are, and new people are literally called noobs in the system. We get our orientation. So that was. I was watching the show Silicon Valley before that, and like trying to absorb as many stereotypes as I possibly could about working in tech. And I get there, and I'm like, oh my god, a lot of them are true, but in a good way, in a way that it's like a community of people working in this vast company with its own sort of rituals and code words and things to and things to consider and things to be mindful of. And so I got there, and it was great. I had a lot of fun. Like I guess I was expecting it, and there I am, like riding my little bicycle around the Facebook campus and posing for a photo by the giant Instagram logo. And I was like, look, dude, just dive all the way in, And I often said to myself, well, I got into politics because when I left news, I wanted to be part of a team, right? Even if it's as simple as politics, where it's like, yeah, red team good, blue team bad, that kind of thing. I get to this new experience, which is like a massive mega corporation. And I was like, just have fun and be part of it. And like everyone was super nice. Orientation was, a dream. There happened to be a giant conference for my department that week. So I stayed on for a couple of days to go to that conference to get oriented and meet a bunch of people. It was like, as they say, drinking from the fire. I was like, for real. Especially, working in politics for 5 years, learning all the weird political and government abbreviations and acronyms. And then you get to tech, and it's a whole other, book like this of abbreviations and acronyms to learn. And so I was like, shit, I got to do this all over again. So, it was worthwhile.
So what is day-to-day like working for Instagram?
I mean, obviously the day-to-day has changed a lot since the pandemic, since we've been working from home for 13, 14 months now. So, I've now been at the company working from home a lot longer than I ever was working from the DC office. And the day to day, my job focuses on a few different things. The first one is making sure that my colleagues around the world have what they need to talk to political staff and governments and nonpartisan agencies about how to use Instagram as best they can. So that's making sure that the technical manuals, which I write and my team writes, or the sort of like the links to the information that they need, or the literal like PowerPoint decks or the keynote decks that we use to talk to people and give presentations. And it's actually giving those presentations as well, whether it's one-on-one to a political office or government that's asked for some special training, or to a training of like a few hundred staff of a certain government or a certain agency or organization. So that's kind of like the first part of the job, which is a lot of fun, which is getting, yes, in part to tell my old stories from the old days and my day in PMO, all that kind of stuff. But also like talking about the new things and the way that Instagram has changed a lot, even just in the past year and a half since the pandemic came out, and the app has been, updated so many times with all kinds of new features. It's really a lot of fun to do that. Second part, I would say, is what we call like civic engagement. So that is I voted and vote stickers. So for example, in the Canada election in 2019, we had vote stickers that went up on the app. So those were designed by a contest at OCAD University, and there was a winner who was selected. And then so all around the world, we kind of do stuff like that. Not always a contest, but we'll find a really cool local artist to design this vote or I voted sticker and get them into the stories trace. So, the day before the election, the day of the election, people can really sort of share that they've participated in democracy and in the voting process, and at the same time kind of engage their friends to think, it's time to vote. Let me vote. And then I guess there's another part that I started to work on a little bit more in the context of the U.S. election, which is media literacy. So working with different media literacy and fact-checking organizations to put out programs to sort of help people be a little bit more media literate to spot hoaxes, false news. So, the day-to-day, it's always an adventure, right? Because everything you can be working on can be disrupted when a high-profile politician is locked out of their Instagram account. Right? All right, we got to fix this. Or when there's a bug that's affecting them. So there's never a dull moment, I will tell you that.
So how do you manage all the contacts that you have? Because I'm assuming you're dealing with governments and so people working in social and governments all around the world. So how do you kind of stay on top of everything? Who's your contact where? Who's in power where? When's an election coming up? Like, how do you keep track of all that? Because that just sounds dizzying.
Yeah, I wonder that to myself sometimes, but it's actually, the answer is a little bit simpler than it seems, because we are obviously a part of the Facebook company, and we get the opportunity to work with our colleagues in offices around the world who are, I guess, technically would be considered working for the Facebook app. But us as the Instagram politics and government team, which is really only like 4 people, get to work with them all over the world, and then sort of work with them on their relationships with governments and with politicians and so forth. So, for example, if a colleague in Germany is like, hey, listen, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs embassy staff from around the world could really use some love, and they could really use a sort of Instagram best practices tutorial, that's where we'll come in and kind of like do that specialized training with them. So, to keep track of it is obviously complicated, because there's no possible way that, a small team can keep track of all that. But we have, like, as a primary mission, to try to keep up those good relationships with our colleagues around the world, first and foremost, to get to know, like, what is it that they need when they talk to governments. Like, what is it are the governments telling them about? How's it going with usage of Instagram for these organizations globally?
And it's just Instagram, right? Like, it's not Instagram and Facebook?
Well, I mean, like, those folks are the ones who handle the Facebook app requests and Facebook app sort of tasks and everyday stuff, like the high level stuff, yes, but also like the, can you verify this? Can you get me back into this account from which I'm locked out? So I focus, myself and the team I'm on, we focus exclusively on Instagram. Just that, there's 4 or 5 of us based in the United States, whereas of course we have those dozens of colleagues around the world that we then sort of like interface with.
Mm. Speaking of verification, how many personal friends and family have asked you if you have the power to verify them or not?
Surprisingly, not a lot. Personal friends and family, they kind of know the deal. Like, I'm sorry, I can't verify you. I do occasionally get the like long lost person who's like, hey, what's up? by the way, can you look into this or can you verify this? And like, there is, trust me when I say there is a protocol that cannot be not followed. And if, like we have to stick to it and those decisions are like specifically taken out of our hands, if there's any time we try to curry favor or do something not so kosher for a friend, the system catches it right away.
Yeah.
Trust me, I've tried. No, just kidding. I've never.
And so what are the challenge, like, because you said you're a team of four, and so so you're mainly interfacing with, for like the reps in the different countries, essentially more so than the parties, like the people working in themselves. Okay, so that probably makes dealing with the different time zones a bit easier then, right?
A little bit easier. Certainly there's I would say, a bias towards, Europe and West Africa, just because time wise, that's what we're able to do in terms of like direct outreach to folks, for example, at number 10 Downing Street in the UK. So did they need a tutorial or a presentation? Or the European Parliament. I've done so far a lot of stuff with the European Parliament and their staff because they're just such a huge organization. But obviously, when it comes to working on stuff with Japan or Indonesia or Singapore, that's 12, 13 hours ahead. And it's just very tricky to always make that work. But we try our best, like we try to keep up as much as we can, two-way communication. The hours are a bit weird, especially in tech where, the focus is on work-life balance way more than it ever is in politics. But we try to make it work.
What are some of those other differences, or even like things you had to adjust to? You mentioned kind of like the lingo and the language, of course, but like what are some other things that you had to adjust going from politics to tech?
I think first and foremost was the adrenaline drop off, 100%. Because in politics, we are all, workaholics to a varying degree, and the stuff you're doing is always like one fire after another. It's stuff that's, for the country. You're working for the country. It's going to be presented as a bill, in the House of Commons. It's something the Prime Minister said. It's a video, something the Prime Minister did. You're just vibrating at this like incredibly busy frequency all the time. Whereas you get to tech, and literally the first thing that happens when you pop open your computer at Facebook is like this thing saying like, "Hi, I'm BalanceBot, and I'm here to make sure that you don't necessarily have to answer messages after hours. You can turn me off if you want." So of course I'm turning it off because I'm still that sort of like, adrenaline junkie at first, but I've learned to appreciate BalanceBot and all the other sort of ways in which, the job is a little bit more easy on your constitution. And my manager's actually been great at that. He's a former Politico as well. He's like, relax, it's not life and death here. And, there's a lot of work to be done, but it'll just get done. You don't have to be up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday tweeting, right?
So how do you replace that adrenaline in your life then? Because it's obviously it's probably some like just recovery time from doing that for so many years, but you're still got to be like craving that adrenaline at some point.
That's a good question. And I think first and foremost comes the realization that level of adrenaline is fundamentally unhealthy, and having two phones glued to your hands at all times is maybe not the best way to operate and to balance your personal and professional life. And then maybe it can't be replaced. Obviously, when the U.S. election came around, all of us were really working our butts off to like support as best we could, to engage voters as best we could, and to make sure that our app was showing up civically, in the best possible way. And that was a bit of like an election thrill in what I had experienced in the past. Obviously not the same, but at the same time, it's like, cool, I'm not on call 24/7, and that's good. I'm not less useful to society because I'm not constantly on my phones. And honestly, it took a lot of working on that, right? And just realizing, God, how do I deal with this? But eventually it fades away.
Was there any like after you once you go through that adjustment period, is there any like quote unquote like catching up on life now that you're not working all the time, you're not on call all the time, like catching up with old friends or doing things you wish you had the time for when you're working in politics? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, in politics, you do have the downtime. It's just the downtime is interrupted at any time by things beeping on your phone. So, it's funny, like literally just like sitting and reading, or I've always wanted to own like a meat smoker, so I bought like a Weber smoker, and like I'll spend some time smoking meat, like just like downtime stuff. You can see behind me, I busted out the electric drums when quarantine happened to try to like to try to make that something of a hobby, though I rarely play them. So it's there's all kinds of different ways to fill time. I don't think anything will ever replace it, but I think it's coming to the realization that like it's okay to not be, working on this sort of staffer energy all the time.
What was the adjustment to work from home like for you guys?
Pretty seamless. I think I consider myself, lucky and blessed that I have a white collar office job that was able to transition seamlessly to work from home. And there's a lot of people out there who didn't have that luxury. And Zoom is inconvenient, and you get Zoom fatigue. And certainly, it feels like the days have no beginning and no end. You just sort of get up and are at work, and eventually realize, oh, I should stop working at one point during this day. But it's honestly been fine. And I think a couple of Facebook offices are gearing up to go back to work, at least at reduced capacity. I'm sure the DC office will follow in short order. Now that a lot of us down here are vaccinated, even though Canada has now eclipsed vaccination rates. I'm so proud of Canada for doing that. Eclipsed the U.S. in vaccination rates. So yeah, the transition was tricky, but it wasn't anything that we couldn't handle. And like, part of the job that I love the most, presenting to audiences and traveling and getting to do like all, cool stuff overseas is, now I do it on webinar, and that's fine. Would I like to travel again? Of course, for sure.
And so pre-pandemic, like how often were you traveling to give these presentations and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say. I mean, I think I went on like 4 or 5 big trips that first year, which was a lot of fun. And, whether I'm in California or we had done some stuff with the European Parliament in Belgium, it's kind of the same vibe, which I enjoy, right? Like traveling, giving the presentation, talking to people, and finding out what's on their mind. Like, what do political staffers today, have on their mind to question you about when they're talking about Instagram and Facebook? And very often, I'm up there giving a pretty high level presentation, and you'll get the high level questions, which is like, how do I make content that connects with an audience, and how do I grow my following, and stuff we've talked about. But there's always a million smaller technical questions that you never think about, that you're like, okay, for folks who are working on this day to day, this is what's on their mind. It's really helpful to know, understand.
What are some of those things that surprised you? Like you said, there's those millions little questions, but like, what are some of those big things that surprised you the most when you came over to Instagram, that like, even from your experience working in politics, that you didn't expect?
Like what? Like, what do you mean?
I don't know, maybe like if there was something about the platform or something, like you use the platform day in and day out, and you get to Instagram and you're like, you can do that with it. Like, was there anything like
Oh,
that?
well, that's an interesting question, because we arrived just as Instagram was like rolling out 1,000,001 new features. And so there were so many things that for us had been like a struggle or a big production. And now they're just sort of like, part of the everyday experience on Instagram. For example, Instagram Live. Man, if you remember when Instagram Live came out, it was a bit of a janky feature. It was new, it was rough and ready, it was great, it was a miracle. But now it's like a lot more solid, and you've got, the ability to add 3 people to your chat. And I'm just like, why wouldn't you everybody use this? This is so cool. Because when I'm giving talks, I'm trying not to be like a salesman for the product. Try not to be like, Instagram is the greatest to the to the exclusion of all other social media platforms. I don't want to be like that at all. And often the conversation will talk about social media in general, and I'll find myself using the word like tweet generically, as a filler for post, right? Just because that office mentality just was like, it was always, Twitter first in the early days, until we brought in a more robust Instagram presence or whatever. So like, I'll catch myself doing that, be like, at least I can sort of talk about it in a real way. If you're sitting down with an audience of people, and I'm sitting there going like, Instagram is the best, and use all this kind of stuff, and don't use anything else, who's going to take me seriously? Nobody, right? Like, I feel like half the time, what they want is a conversation about social media. And that's like what I love more than anything.
So as part of your presentation, obviously not, it's mainly focused on Instagram, but is there elements where it's like how to use Instagram cohesively with the other social media, have like an overarching strategy? Like that's a part of your conversations?
I always get that question at every presentation I get, which is, how do you know what content goes on what platform? Or, we are short staffed, we have limited hands and limited bodies. So if I'm cutting a video, that video is going to be horizontal for Facebook and Twitter, and not necessarily, for example, vertical for stories. So what do you suggest, right? And then it's sort of like my job to, recommend strategies or different ways to think about an event that has happened that day and how you create different pieces of content around it, even if you're short staffed. For example, Instagram stories, which I absolutely love for the political world, because it allows you to like break up a political concept or a political theory or bill that you want to pass into short bites that allow you to use like the stickers, like the question sticker, the poll sticker, all this kind of ways of thinking about a policy that you might not get in a longer video, right? So you can break up the experience and have it be a little more interactive for people. Sorry to sound like an Instagram salesman there.
No, that's okay. And you said you're also putting together like technical guides. Are these like publicly available guides or guides that just people working in government can have access to?
Oh yeah, no, those are all publicly available. In fact, they are specifically made publicly available because we don't ever want to be favoring, one branch of the government over the other, one party over the other. Everything we do is in public, on the web, all the guides we've got, everything like that, just so that people understand that like we're here for everyone.
Okay. And I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this next question. And it like what's the most like you kind of mentioned how people always ask about the other social networks, but what's like the most common thing people are asking you at these events?
Can I get verified? No, like there will always be people with verification questions or what we call like ops questions, like they're locked out or this or that. I mean, I think the common question that is the common thread of everything is like, how do I create engaging content for Instagram for my politician, for my government agency? Like I understand that I had, I guess, the opportunity to work for a politician who was a bit of a celebrity, with or without his own social media, who was a celebrity, a star in that world, and had an absolutely terrific photographer long before I got there, right? So if you're dealing with, a Ministry of Transport, it's necessarily a little bit more unsexy. And I use that example because I always like to talk about the British Columbia Ministry of Transport. They do such a great job on social media. Their account is literally about highways, right? Like there's no like handsome politician behind that account. So what makes them good, what sets them apart is, storytelling and using the tools of Instagram to speak to people in a way that they expect to be spoken to on Instagram, as opposed to like preached to by a press release in that sort of way.
So like how do you have any like examples, like concrete examples of like what they're doing in BC with that account?
Yeah, two things. So like one is an example I use all the time in my presentations, which is like they were just announcing, the unveiling of one of those machines that like moves the lanes over at one rush hour and then moves them back to the other side another rush hour. Like the dullest thing you can imagine. How do you make that exciting? But their post was good. It was short, it was snappy, it was to the point, and you had a nice piece of video. Or the other day, I think they removed some anti-Semitic graffiti from an underpass, and they were tweeting about it. Well, and it was just like the way they talk. They talk like normal human beings. Our director of communications in the prime minister's office used to always say, talk like people talk as much as you can, right? It's not always easy in politics. It's certainly not easy like running a provincial ministry of transport account, but they're showing they're showing on social media, showing how they do the work. They're, sandblasting or whatever, this graffiti, this anti-Semitic graffiti off the underpass. They're speaking in a short, sort of snappy Twitter way. I think at one point they were like, we're working on it. And then they followed up with another tweet that was like, and it's gone. Right. So like a bit of a South Park reference in there. Right. Right. There's just like a way that they do things without being corny, without being cheesy. That's like, hey, we are here. We are working for you, the people of British Columbia. But we're not like super serious, nor are they, like I said, one of those cringy ass food accounts or brand accounts that you see that's just like, oh God, get that out of my face,
Is there like from a management of social media perspective, obviously like not including like with government, there's going to be probably more red tape compared to like a private sector company. Like what are some things that just make it like, is there anything different day to day for managing it beyond the government side of things?
You mean that make it like a little bit more complicated to run a government social media account?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, we deal with some government clients who are like, I'm not allowed to take screenshots on my phone because of security. Like our phone, the screenshotting feature on my phone is disabled. Like screenshots, the lifeblood of social media in a lot of ways, and they can't do it. So governments will always have like quirky security regulations, all kinds of strange workarounds that like you need to figure out. Look, we had Blackberries those first couple of years. So from a technical side, there's always those considerations. And then from like a political side, I think the number one lesson we learned once upon a time was don't schedule posts ever. So I know that in social media, there's a million and one third-party programs that'll schedule your post. They'll manage your social media. They'll do whatever you want them to do. If you buy the VIP package or whatever. Not to denigrate those apps, but in politics, you sure as hell need to remember that there could be a major earth-shattering piece of news on the Saturday morning where you had your super lighthearted Instagram post about something fun ready to go out, and holy hell, you want to make sure that doesn't go out and that you don't forget about it. So like that is number one, do not schedule a post. So there's a million and one examples of like weird, quirky stuff about politics to remember in social, that sometimes I wish I could work for like Moon Pie or whatever and like, work on the Moon Pie account. I criticize it, but like, that seems like there would be a lot more freedom to just be fun and hang out. Maybe they had too much freedom. Maybe they had too much freedom. Or like a sport, yeah, or like a sports account. Like, you worked for a sports team. Like they have so much fun in ways that, in a lot of ways, a political account can't.
Yeah, you can't be chirping back and forth with your competition from a political account the same way you do with a sports team.
No, sir, you cannot. No, sir, you cannot.
What are some of your favorite parts about working at Instagram?
I mean, it's a really fun job. It's a fun place. It's, the culture is amazing. It's people marching in step for a goal, that like, and that changes a lot. Like we're working together on this to launch this product. We're working together on this policy objective. I work on the policy team technically. So there's a lot of stuff in terms of like product policy, content policy that I don't have a direct day-to-day engagement with, or that I don't specifically work on that. But like, I go to the meetings and it's fascinating, so like, there's a lot of interesting stuff in terms of like working at a tech company, working at a giant social media company with everything that entails in this day and age. That's like, there is never a dull moment, is a lovely place to work. And, it's the kind of place where I feel like super supported, and that if I, wanted to spin off and do something 180 degrees different within the company, everyone would be like, yeah, that's great. What do you want to do? And would at least sort of be receptive to me doing that.
As someone who has worked in social for the last number of years, worked for Instagram, you're not super duper active. Like you don't have a crazy personal brand or anything on social media. And I'm curious if that's intentional, like because you're on it all day for work, you just have no energy once you're done.
It's not so much that I have no energy. It's that like 5 years in politics dulled my instinct to like post a lot. You know what I mean? Like I was careful, like I was careful because I had to be, because number one, you don't want to post on the wrong account. But number two, it's like, look, I'm in politics and I don't want to ever like be a target or make my person look bad or anything like that. So I just like, cooled it a little bit, not a lot. I would say I'm definitely like not in the hot take business, perhaps as much as I would want to. Like my takes are lukewarm if I've got a take. If not, I'll just like, tweet about hockey or whatever. And on IG, same thing, like my life has changed a lot. I moved down to DC and I've got this job and whatever, but it's like at a certain point, I'm like, I don't always want to be posting as much as I used to. And I, it's just something that I think about a lot, but I don't really know what the answer is to answer your question. It's like, why don't I post that much? I don't know. Maybe I'm just a private person. I work in social media, but I'm a little bit more private than I thought I was, even though, my account's public and all the rest.
This next question is kind of tied to the fact that there wasn't a lot about you on social media. It might need a little explaining, but I'm going to see if you get it just off the hop. Do you still have mad rhythm?
No, I've never had mad rhythm. Is that a reference to an old video of me that is Googleable somewhere? I gotta get one of those services like reputation.com or whatever it is, and like just clean up all the old like flotsam and jetsam of like my crap from social media from God knows how long ago.
I was just saying, I'm pretty sure I just typed in your name on YouTube and it came up.
Oh yes. I don't want to know what else comes up. For the
Not
record,
much.
I have never had mad rhythm at any point.
And I'm curious, kind of on the note of just back to how you're talking about you've always been careful just because of your job and stuff. Were you expecting when you left working with the Prime Minister's office to go to Instagram that it would make news? Like there was articles about the fact that you were leaving that were like in CBC and stuff. Like, were you expecting that?
There was an article in CBC that I don't know if I was expecting it or not. I mean, I think at the time, in the Ottawa bubble, I think there was something in the Hill Times that I saw because, it's
maybe that
whatever.
was it. I can't, I don't have my links and stuff, but I remember seeing a couple of articles about you stepping down.
Yeah, like you're a staffer in the PMO, so there's going to be interest in comings and goings and all that kind of thing. But it was pretty low key. Like everyone was, everyone was pretty respectful about me leaving and me coming and managing those expectations and all the rest. So I think it was okay. Like I was worried, but then I think also as political staffers, we start to think that we're way more important than we are. You know what I mean? Like, especially in the digital realm, and you just have to realize like life goes on, the machinery of government goes on without you, and that'll be that.
The most important question I'm going to ask is, why do you pronounce it GIF and not GIF?
Because that's the right goddamn way to pronounce it. Okay, that's the way to do it, and there is research behind this. If you watch the Webby Awards for when they gave the Lifetime Achievement Award to the dude who created the GIF, he, on the Webby Awards, your acceptance speech can only be 5 words. So he goes up on stage, and I think he no longer has the ability to speak, but I think his speech was projected behind him, and his acceptance speech was just, it's pronounced, and then JIF. It's pronounced GIF. So I will die on that hill, 7 days a week.
That's amazing. How often do you reflect on the whole journey? Going all the way back to California with Leno, to working in news, Liberals, that first election, working with Trudeau, Instagram. Like, how often do you look back on everything?
A lot, dude. I'm a nostalgic guy. I'm in my head a lot about life choices and decisions I've made, and that's just the way I am. I think about it all the time, like one decision leading to another, and how I got here and how I got there, and like here I am in Washington D.C. working at Instagram, and I'm like, I guess everything led up to this point, and like, how did one thing lead into another? I don't know, but I look back on it now, I'm like, cool, like this is, I feel pretty blessed, and I'm, enjoying this work a lot. Do I miss politics? A ton, all the freaking time. Like it's just the way it is, right? Like it's. I don't think anything, like I said, will ever get back to that level of excitement. But I do think about the journey a lot for sure.
For the last question, I like to flip the script a little bit. So instead of me asking the question, it's you asking the question, but it's not to me. So pretend you have a crystal ball. You can ask this crystal ball any question. You'll get the 100% honest answer. What is one question you'd want to know the answer to?
Crystal ball. Crystal ball. Where will the social media world be in 15 to 20 years? And will I be entirely too old to keep working on it at that age? And will social media be, implanted in our brain and so forth? And what will it all look like? I think about that all the time. I wish I had a crystal ball.
Awesome. I love it. No one's ever asked that question before, and I enjoyed that question. But I want to thank you so much for taking time to be on the podcast. I want to give you the floor. Where can the people find you? Plug anything and everything you got right now.
Oh, thank you so much, Jacob. I really appreciate it. You can find me on Instagram, of course, at DiamondDave22, and on Twitter at RealDaveSummer. So that's me. That's where to find me.
Awesome. Well, make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below so people can find it. And I want to thank you once again for taking time to be on the podcast. And I want to thank everybody for listening, whether you've listened the entire way through or you only listen to bits and pieces. I really appreciate you taking time to check this out. Everyone do me a big favor, go and follow Dave. He might not post a lot, but he's definitely a good follow. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes.
Yeah, like I posted decent. If I make it sound like my socials are like that tumbleweed.
I'm talking about Instagram.
I post a good amount. All right. Okay. Yes. On Instagram.
I'm talking about Instagram. Twitter, yes. You're more active on Twitter. I'll give you that. More active on Twitter than you are at Instagram. I'll walk back that statement. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for listening. If you'd like to find me, you can find me everywhere on social media at the Jacob Kelly. Feel free to come and say hello. As always, today's podcast is powered by TRUFAN. Thank you once again for listening, everybody. We'll talk soon.